Thank you very much. Okay,
Right.
Clara, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to give a talk here at the TropiBEF Workshop 2020 about the Efforts B project, which is a biodiverse enrichment experiment in oil palm plantations, of which you are the scientific coordinator. Dr. Clara Zemp obtained her PhD in nerve system sciences from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany in 2015. Her research focuses on understanding mechanisms and dynamics linking biodiversity, climate, and land use in tree-based natural and agricultural systems in the tropics. Currently, Clara Zemp awaits to join the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland in February 21 as an assistant professor with a tenure track position. There, she will lead the conservation biology lab and will continue her research with ecosystem multifunctionality in tropical forests. Welcome, Dr. Clara Zemp. The stage is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Leonardo, for the introduction and for the invitation. It's, yeah, of course, it's a very great pleasure for me to participate as a keynote here and to have the opportunity to present some of the key findings from the last 5 years that I've been working on this project on the biodiversity enrichment experiments. That is, as you said, part of the interdisciplinary project efforts based at the University of Göttingen and in collaboration with several universities in Indonesia. So yeah, it's of course also very impressive to give a presentation after the talk of Ghislaine, which was very nice and very inspiring. So I hope I will give some other insights on other projects of restoration, and hopefully we'll have some discussions at the end. Okay, so just start. I also have a video taken from a drone as well. For those of you who never traveled to Southeast Asia, you don't know how an oil palm plantation look like, and that is actually an industrial scale monoculture of oil palm that is spreading over hundreds or even thousands of hectares. And of course, that is a widespread expansion in this region of the world, and potentially also will expand further, also in other places. The efforts project I've been involved in looked at the impact of this transformation of rainforest to oil palm plantation. And here's just to give you a short idea on how, what are the impacts of this transformation. And here, these researchers compared the level of different ecosystem functions in forest and in oil palm plantation. And what you can see is that for most of these ecosystem functions, the level is drastically reduced in oil palm monoculture compared to rainforest, except harvested biomass. That is one of the only ecosystem functions that remain. And this is basically the palm oil fruits that are harvested and used for the industry, for biofuel or agro-industry. And it's not only about ecosystem functioning, but also about biodiversity. And here is also a nice review showing the overall impacts of rainforest transformation to oil palm on different taxonomy groups in terms of species richness and also in terms of abundances. And we see for most of the taxa here, reduction in diversity and abundance. So the key question, as Giselle mentioned, that we are entering the ecosystem of restoration, is how can we restore such land use that are intensively used, that are highly productive. And by restoration here, I mean increasing biodiversity and increasing ecosystem functioning while maintaining a certain level of productivity and economic benefits of these landscapes. So one of the strategy would be this so-called tree islands planting, also called applied nuclei, which consist of planting small patches or small islands of trees in a landscape that is treeless, agricultural landscape. So in our case, it would be an oil palm monoculture plantation. And once we do this, we can either let these tree islands spread naturally, and after some time they will form some kind of complex heterogeneous tree cover environment, or we decide to maintain the surrounding land use as productive agricultural land. And these tree islands form some kind of stepping stones in the landscape, allow biodiversity to move, but also provide locally some benefits for biodiversity and ecosystem function. Another strategy for ecological restoration in this agricultural lands would be to use agroforestry. In this case, it consists of mixing different tree species together with the cash crop. In our case, it's the oak palm. So we can do this by planting or by allowing natural regeneration. And this can be, for example, implemented around natural vegetation area to create some buffer zones or ecological corridor to connect fragments, for example. So in the efforts B experiments, we ask two very practical, concrete questions. The first one is whether this strategy is actually suited for ecological restoration in oak palm plantation. So whether we can use this concept to increase biodiversity and ecosystem functioning while maintaining some kind of productivity of the oak palm, as we expect that the trees might compete with the oak palm and reduce the yields, and so the economic value. Secondly, what would be the best tree diversity, the best species to plant, and also the size of the tree islands. Best in the sense of maximizing the restoration, so maximizing biodiversity, abundance, ecosystem functioning, and minimizing the trade-offs with the economic function. So we are here in Indonesia, in the island of Sumatra. This map has been shown also in the talk by Ghislaine, and this is here one of the few experiments located in the tropics. And in our experiment, we planted 6 different species, which are used for different purposes: fruits, timber, or rubber trees. And they are all native and also have different ecological characteristics. So here is a brief overview of the design. So we implemented the experiment in a conventional oak palm plantation, and each of these squares here represent one of our experimental plots, and they have a different level of diversity, so different number of tree species that were planted. From 0, that means no trees were planted, 1, 2, up to 6 different tree species, and every time these trees were planted in between or together with the oak palms. The experiment plots have also different sizes, from 5 by 5 to 40 by 40. And in addition, we have 4 control plots that are conventionally managed oak palm monoculture, oak palm plantations. And so you see here in a zoom in a plot where here the different squares, the light green square represents the planted trees. And these are the oak palms. Some of them remain and some of them were felled. About 40% of all the oak palms were removed or were felled in order to give heterogeneous condition and also some space and light for the trees to establish. So yeah, just an overview of the establishment of the experiment. That was in end of 2013, where, as I said, the oak palms were felled, some of them, and the trees were planted on a 2-meter grid. And here's a view of how the plot looked like shortly after planting. And now I would like to show you how it looks recently. So that was last year. So you see the surrounding oak palm plantation. And here is one of our 40 by 40 square meter plots. And you see that the trees reach already considerable heights. Some of them reach up to 15 meters or so, and as high as the surrounding oak palms. And of course, the performance differed between the species. And in this plot, 6 different species were planted. And we can actually see 4 of them here from this image. So on average, the heights of the trees were about 2.5 meters up to 5.5 meters for the different species. But as I said, it really differs between the species. And here is the entrance of the experimental plots. You see that it was fenced. This was to protect the cattle and perturbation by wild boars, for example, to maintain the plots and also to allow natural regeneration, so to avoid grazing. And that is a view from the inside of one of our high diversity plots, where we have here the 6 different planted tree species. You see also some understory vegetation that is in fact dominated by a shrub, an invasive shrub, Clidemia hirta here. Still, we see some interesting patterns. For example, there are trees that establish spontaneously. For example, here ficus that are dispersed by bats. We see also some signs of biodiversity with lots of nests and so on. And also quite interesting is the litter layer that is already quite thick compared to the conventional plantation where there is basically nothing on the soil. We see also some closed canopy and some trees bearing fruits already. So now jumping to the first results, which is the OPAM yield, because that's one of the key variable that, of course, everyone is interested in, is how does this affect the productivity of the plantation of the OPAM. So what we did is monitoring the yields of the OPAM that are located inside our plots and also adjacent to our plots. So you see here the border of our experimental plots, and here currently this man is harvesting the OPAM that is directly next to it. And we also monitor the one in position 2 and 3, so that we really have like an understanding of the potential spillover effects of our experimental treatment on the surrounding plantation. And we compare that to reference OPAMs that are located far from our experimental plots, but still within the plantation. So that's supposed to be independent and can be used as reference. And what we see after 4 to 5 years is that the yields of the OPAM inside our plots are not different than the reference. So there is no loss or gain, but there is a positive effect on the yield of the adjacent OPAM. So we do see that these OPAM around our experimental plots increase the yield, and so we have a spillover effect in the surrounding plantation. Now, looking at the vegetation structure, here we use the terrestrial laser scanner to create this high resolution, 3-dimensional model of the vegetation. And we compared the level of structural complexity in forest, in our experimental plots, and in OPAM monoculture. And what is shown here is the stand structural complexity index that measures different aspects. So basically, the first aspect is related to the vertical stratification, so how many layers there are vertically. And secondly, whether there are gaps or whether they are dense and compact occupation of space. So these 2 dimensions are incorporated into this integrated index here. And what we see is that after 3 years after planting, we find a significant enhancement of the stand structural complexity index in our experimental plots with tree planting compared to the OPAM plantation. And of course, we are still quite far from the level reached in the tropical forests, but that was also not our purpose. So now some results, as rather fresh results, showing the impact on biodiversity. So quantified here as the effective number of species, also called the yield numbers, for different taxonomy groups. So this is the results of around 25 different students, researchers, assistants who collected data samples in the field. And this spider diagram here shows the level of the biodiversity in our experimental plots, which which is shown here in the dashed black line. And we compare that to the level found in the control conventional oak palm plantation. And what we see, so of course there is some variability here shown in the color, but still quite interestingly is that 5 years after planting, we see significant enhancements of many different groups, in particular the birds, the soil fauna, spontaneous established trees. But we see here a reduced number of seed species diversity compared to the conventional palm plantation. So there might be here some disruption of the natural regeneration process. Also in terms of pathotrophic fungi, we see a reduction in the diversity compared to the conventional oak palm. So we're not sure whether this is good or bad for the ecosystem, but that's something we do observe. Now looking at another aspect, which is the abundance. So how many individuals of these different taxonomy groups have been sampled, have been observed. And we do see for most of the taxonomy group here a significant enhancement, in particular the propagals here, pollen seeds, but also the spontaneous trees and again the birds. Also here is a view of how does this affect the ecosystem functioning. It's quite complex. We measure the range of different things in the soil, on the vegetation, the water regulation and productivity. And what we see is that overall enhancement of most of these ecosystem function, in particular the litter inflow and some soil properties like higher soil phosphorus, lower soil C/N ratio, and higher water infiltration in the soil. The oak palm yield, as I mentioned, depended on whether this spillover effect was considered or not. And if it was considered, then there was no changes. We also derive these indices of multi-diversity, multi-abundance, and multifunctionality that are based on some threshold approach. We can talk about it if you're interested, but these are just some integrated measure of these different restoration outcomes. So to summarize the first research question, whether these strategies are suitable for ecological restoration in our oak palm plantation. So the answer is rather yes, that we increased most of the restoration outcome that we looked at. And we didn't found a reduction in the oak palm yields, which is quite surprising as we were expecting some strong loss here, but that was not the case. However, of course, we are still far from the level of structural complexity found in forests, and also probably the biodiversity is not the same as the one found in the rainforest. We did have some problem of plant invasion with here the two most widespread plants in the understory, including this invasive shrub here, Clidemia hirta, which is of course problematic, and that is one of the effect of allowing natural regeneration to happen, so that we have this invasion happening. So now trying to look at this second question of how can we achieve this best? So what level of tree diversity, what size of the plots do we need, and what tree species are best suited for ecological restoration? You see here two examples of our experimental plots that are very different. So this is to illustrate that there is a high variability depending on which tree species were planted and how many. Here, I just would like to briefly mention the effects of tree diversity and tree species identity on the performance of the trees. And here, this is based on a bootstrapping approach, quantifying these so-called standardized effect size. So it's the effect of tree diversity on tree growth and tree survival compared to the plots where only one trees were planted. And we do see that there is a positive enhancement of tree growth in the high diversity plot level. However, if we look at the species-specific response, we see in particular for survival that there is strong differences between the species, with basically 3 species here performing pretty badly, with the survival rates lower than 30 or 40%, and other 3 that perform really well with more than 80% survival. The same also for the growth rates. Of course, it depends strongly. So in fact, it is rather which species was planted that drives most of the response in terms of performance. And that also explains this effect of diversity that is basically related to the selection effect we've heard about before in the previous talks. I then looked at the effect of tree diversity on the structural complexity index, and using here a linear model for random partition design. I'm very glad that this random partition design was introduced in the previous talk, so I don't have to talk about it too much detail. And basically the idea here of this model is that we can look at the linear response and the deviation from this linear response. And here we see a clear nonlinear response to tree diversity, and this might be due to 2 things: either the species identity, so what species was planted, or the so-called nonlinear richness, which is basically the tree diversity treated as a factor that is independent on the species identity, and that can be used to kind of a proxy to quantify the interactions between species. And so here in an analysis of variance, we observe that in this case, indeed, the species identity was the most important factor explaining this relationship here. But nevertheless, we found some significant non-negligible tree species interaction. So what I did next to understand a bit more this variability, this heterogeneity in terms of vegetation structure, is running here a principal component analysis of 12 different vegetation structure variables. And quite interestingly, is we see here 2 major axes that explain more than half of the overall variability. And these are related to 2 major dimensions. The first axis here, the horizontal, is related to the structural complexity or vegetation density in 3 dimensions, as opposed to lots of gaps in the canopy and on the story cover. So that's the first axis. And the second axis is related to whether the canopy cover is dominated by the oil palms here on the top or by the trees. And we could quantify that using drone-based imagery to separate out the canopy cover. So what I did next is including these 2 principal components here in a structural equation model to quantify the direct and indirect effects of tree diversity and size of the tree islands on our restoration outcome. So the indirect effect would be related to these changes in the vegetation structure. And what we can see is that tree diversity enhances the 3-dimensional density, the complexity, and this in turn impacts the restoration outcome, which is shown here in the light pink color. And so this figure is quite complex, not going too much into the detail, but basically I just would like to highlight particular points. For abundance, you see in most of the cases, for most of the groups, there is a negative impact on this structural complexity, on this 3D density. So this means that most of the groups, the taxonomy groups, are adapted to open habitats, disturbed habitats, and they are in fact more abundant in plots with lots of gaps and understory vegetation. We do see some positive effect though on the diversity. So abundance and diversity are 2 different things, and in this case, it was positive for diversity and negative for abundance. In terms of ecosystem functioning, we see a positive impact on different functions related to pollination, litter inputs, above ground biomass, tree growth, and negative effects on the yield of the oil palm. So here we see some trade-offs between the different functions as we were expecting. So without going further detail here, you see this quite complex, and depending on the groups, depending on the variables that we look at, the response is different. So there is kind of no one single response that would apply to every restoration outcome that we look at. So to summarize this second aspect here, how to do it best. Well, do not have, unfortunately, a clear answer to that, because it depends, of course, as most of the time in science. We do found that tree diversity enhanced the growth and structural complexity. And that was mainly driven by this identity effect. So what tree species were planted. There was some cascading effects of diversity on the restoration outcome. And these were either positive for biodiversity, for several ecosystem function, but negative for the abundance and for the open yield. So there are some kind of trade-offs here, especially between the economic and the ecological function. And also, as I said, it's quite complex. So there is no one single strategy that would apply to all restoration outcomes, and that we need to define clear targets. What do we want to restore if we want to implement this kind of system? So, of course, we measured a lot of different things, but there are other aspects that are as important, especially the fruits of the trees that are harvested and that can be used for selling or for cooking, and also for including women in this process of rural economy. And that is something we did not quantify, but would be really important to do so. And another aspect which I found also quite interesting is the potential of this system to provide inspiration and education. And we did some fun activities with school children in the surrounding, but of course that is very difficult to quantify in terms of benefits. And yeah, just to finalize here, mention that this experiment is not just an academic one, an academic exercise, but draw a lot of attention from the farmers, from restoration managers. We even had the visit of the representative of oil palm industry, of the ministry, and so on. So it really drawing a lot of attention. And yeah, we do hope that with our research we can provide some information, but unfortunately not as a simple message as they are looking for. And yeah, with that, I would like to thank, of course, all my colleagues, the students, the assistants in the field who did really an amazing job. And this is a teamwork, of course, with the different professors from the University of Göttingen and also in Indonesia. And yeah, thank you very much for your attention. And I would like to end with this nice drone image or drone video. Thank you.